The galaxy is a wound that never closes. Its edges fester with wars without number, and within its core lies a throne that bleeds light into the void. To be born here is to inherit suffering as birthright, for every dawn is written in ash, and every night is a hymn to the dead. In this place, hope is not a gift but a rumor, whispered in the shadows of manufactoria and trenches, prayed for by men who know their gods will not answer. And yet, within this crucible of despair, destinies unfold that shape not only the living, but the endless machinery of the Imperium itself. What if one such destiny began not with a cry in a Terran cradle, but in a galaxy that had already forgotten mercy? What if Harry Potter, child marked for a story of survival, was born not to the soft world of wands and whispered Latin, but to the endless furnace of Warhammer 40,000? Before we walk further into this darkness, if you find yourself drawn into these imagined echoes, into the clash of mythologies, and the possibility of a boy carrying both curse and salvation, lend your strength to this channel. Like, share, and subscribe, so that these stories may reach further into the void, and the machine spirits of the algorithm might awaken to carry them to others who still listen for tales in the dark. The first cries of a newborn did not echo in warmth, nor in the hush of candlelit rooms. They reverberated, instead, through the iron belly of a manufactorum, where lumen strips flickered overhead and the walls wept condensation from pipes that never cooled. The child who should have known soft blankets was swaddled instead in rough, oil-stained cloth, his tiny lungs filling with recycled air laced with chem dust. Around him, servitors moved in jerks and whirs, their flesh long since sacrificed to machinery, their vox grills chanting binary hymns that passed for lullabies in this place. For those born beneath the gaze of the Adeptus Mechanicus, infancy was no gentle welcome but a conscription into endurance. His mother, thin from years of labor quotas, looked down upon him with eyes dulled by fatigue and yet alight with a stubborn spark. She whispered prayers not to spirits of wood or hearth, but to the Emperor enthroned on Terra, far away and never answering. The baby's skin bore the pallor of those who had never known the sun, and across his brow, already, fate left its cruel token. A scar, thin and jagged, a wound that seemed older than his flesh. The overseers glanced at it with suspicion, but dismissed it with shrugs. Marks were common. Life in the Imperium was carved into the body by machinery and accident before one could speak. Yet still, the midwife muttered a litany, crossing the air with a trembling hand, as though she felt a presence too heavy to ignore. The manufactorum did not pause for his birth. The roar of pistons and the grinding of gears continued without mercy, drowning out the tender sounds of life with the metallic thunder of production. Every moment, promethium burned, steel was cast, and quotas demanded flesh. The cries of one infant were as nothing against the chorus of industry. Yet somewhere in the hidden depths of that vast hive, among endless rows of churning assembly lines and sleeping pallets stacked like coffins, a story began that was not written in the ledgers of the AD mini-stratum. The boy's early years unfolded within corridors that stank of sweat and machine oil. His toys were discarded bolts and rusted washers, clutched in hands already calloused from scrabbling at the floor. He learned to crawl across grated walkways, his knees bruised by metal ridges, his ears filled with the ever-present hum of the manufactorum's great engines. The voices around him were not soft, melodic tales of myth and magic, but the monotone droning of litanies, repeated endlessly by laborers who knew that without ritual, the machines would not tolerate them. "Blessed be the cog," they intoned, blessed be the hand that bleeds. It was into this choir of exhaustion that the child's laughter thin, fleeting, almost alien sometimes broke through, a sound that startled his mother and drew wary glances, as though joy itself were subversive. There was no childhood in the sense that softer worlds might know it. Survival replaced play, obedience replaced wonder. Yet even here, fate etched its will with unrelenting precision. The scar on his forehead, that jagged brand, became a subject of quiet speculation. Some whispered it was the mark of an accident in the birthing ward, a shard of steel dropped from a careless surgeon. Others murmured it was a curse, an omen that would bring scrutiny from the overseers, or worse, the Mechanicus priests who walked the assembly floors like gods of flesh and steel. His mother told no one of the strange way it sometimes seemed to glimmer beneath the lumen light, though she saw it often, and each time her prayers grew longer, more desperate in the nights if they could be called nights. For the hive never truly slept. His mother rocked him beside the rattling heat vents, whispering fragments of old Terran lullabies remembered only in broken form. She wove them into the sanctioned prayers, masking memory with devotion. For even song could be considered heresy if it spoke of comfort the Imperium did not sanction. Her son would gaze up at her with eyes that seemed too watchful for an infant, as if he already understood that he had been born into a cage from which no escape was possible. And yet, against the machinery, against the hymns, against the iron weight of the Imperium's indifference, he endured. His first breath was choked with ash, and still he breathed again. Perhaps it was nothing more than chance, a quirk of survival in a galaxy where billions perished unnamed every day. Or perhaps, as the laborers muttered when the scar caught the lumen's glow, the Emperor's gaze had brushed him in passing. Whatever the truth, the manufactorum that birthed him did not care. It demanded only his body, his strength, his life to keep the gears turning. But destiny does not ask permission of machines, and in the silence between the hammer strikes and the hiss of steam, something stirred. The years pressed upon him with the relentlessness of machinery. Childhood in the manufactorum was not measured in games or in lessons of imagination, but in the weight of quotas and the sharp sting of discipline when those quotas faltered. By the time he could stand without clutching the rusted bars of a cot, the boy had already learned the rhythm of work. He carried small tasks at first, fetching tools for those whose hands shook too much from exhaustion to hold them, or gathering the rivets dropped by trembling fingers. His scar, always visible, grew with him, a pale crack across the brow that drew the eye, no matter how his mother tried to keep it hidden beneath cloth. Others noticed. The laborers, faces blackened by soot and etched by fatigue, whispered when they thought the overseers could not hear. The Imperium did not forgive difference, for difference drew attention, and attention invited suspicion. Still, rumor slithered through the dormitory bunks like smoke, suggesting that this boy carried something upon him, a brand that was more than an accident of metal and chance. Some swore that when he wept, the lumen strips above him flickered, sputtering for a heartbeat as though embarrassed by their own weakness. Others spoke of the way his cries seemed to echo farther than sound should travel, as if the walls themselves carried the noise deeper into the manufactorum. His mother dismissed such tales, insisting he was just a child, but in her eyes, shadowed by exhaustion and sharpened by fear, there lingered a recognition she would not voice aloud. The overseers were not blind. Their augmetic eyes scanned the boy with cold indifference, recording every stumble and every instance of resilience. Yet to them, a child was a commodity, a number in a ledger. If he lived long enough, he would join the line. Another cog in the endless procession of humanity ground into the Imperium's great machine. If he died before that, his bones would be rendered into ash for the reclamation furnaces, and his existence forgotten. It was neither cruelty nor kindness, merely the Imperium's truth. And so, they did not strike him down for his mark, nor did they elevate him. They watched, as one might watch a strange gear to see whether it would fit, or shatter under pressure. Food was rationed to the point of cruelty. Flavorless paste dispensed from rusted canisters. Enough to keep a body moving, never enough to allow strength. The boy gnawed at it, with teeth too young for the strain, swallowing lumps of bitterness and chasing them with sips of recycled water that tasted of iron and old pipes. Hunger became a companion, its presence as constant as the hum of the machines. Yet he did not wither. Somehow, in defiance of the environment that stole the vigor from children before they reached their first decade, he endured. His mother fed him her own portions, though her body thinned further, her face hollowed by sacrifice. It was during one such meal, when the ration canisters hissed out their sludge and the laborers muttered their mealtime litanies, that an accident revealed something the boy himself did not yet understand. A fellow child, older by several years, shoved him aside in the scramble for food. He stumbled, struck his head against the edge of a steel table, and blood welled around his scar. The mess hall gasped into silence. The wound flared crimson in the dim lumen light, but the boy did not cry. He pressed a small hand to his brow, his breathing steady, and the cut closed faster than flesh should. Not instantly, not miraculously, but unnaturally quick, the blood slowing, the skin knitting until only the scar remained. Bright and angry, the silence held only a moment before the clamor resumed, forced and nervous. Overseers barked orders, laborers lowered their heads, and the incident was buried beneath routine. But in the hidden recesses of conversation, behind the bulkheads where whispers thrived, the story spread. The boy with the scar was not merely marked, he was touched. By what? No one agreed. Some claimed it was the Emperor's favor, others feared it was the taint of the warp. His mother said nothing, only cleaned the blood from his brow with trembling hands, whispering prayers so quiet they were swallowed by the noise of the machinery. Night in the manufactorum was not darkness, but a dimming of lumens, a lowering of noise that never truly ceased. It was here, in the half-light, that the boy began to dream. His sleep was restless, filled with visions of light so bright it blinded, of shadows that moved without shape, of whispers in languages he could not understand yet somehow felt. He woke, drenched in sweat, his scar hot beneath his fingers, his breath ragged. His mother held him close, telling him to hush, to sleep, to let the Emperor's light guard his soul. But the boy knew, even without words, that the light in his dreams was not the astral. It was something else, something older, and it frightened him. Still, the days continued. Work, hunger, whispers, dreams. The manufactorum did not care for prophecy or portent. But sometimes, when the boy sat in silence and watched the lumen strips flicker, when he listened to the endless hymn of machinery, he felt as though the walls themselves were waiting for something, waiting for him. The manufactorum was a world entire, a sealed coffin of iron and smoke. Few ever saw beyond its walls, and those who did often returned as corpses or not at all. For the boy, this closed horizon was all he knew, and yet, even as his feet learned the rhythm of the walkways and his hands learned the bite of steel, something in him ached for a wider sky. He had no name for it, no words, only a restless hunger that throbbed alongside the scar on his brow. a pulse that seemed to beat in time with some hidden current deeper than the roar of machines. Children in the Manufactorum were raised not by choice but by necessity. As soon as they could stand, they were folded into labor, their games reduced to mimicry of the adults who bent over conveyor belts and hammered at broken gears. The boy was no different. He learned quickly, faster than those around him, memorizing the patterns of work and the litanies that accompanied them. The overseers, whose augmetic lenses missed nothing, noticed this too. Efficiency was prized, and though they offered no praise, they spared him the harsher punishments that fell upon slower children. In the Imperium, survival was often mistaken for favor, and in those small mercies, a strange pattern of protection began to form around him. But there were dangers no skill could avoid. The Manufactorum was a hungry beast, and every year it devoured hundreds of workers in accidents that were neither recorded nor mourned. One such day, as the boy dragged a basket of rivets across the assembly floor, a mechanical arm malfunctioned. Its piston jammed, then snapped free with the force of a thunderbolt, hurtling a jagged shard of metal across the walkway. The shard should have split his skull. Laborers gasped, some even ducked, but the boy simply froze. The shard struck a beam inches from his head, embedding itself deep, quivering like a spear. He did not flinch, only touched the scar on his brow as though he had known whether danger would fall before it did. Whispers became bolder after that. The Emperor protected him, some said. Others muttered that no such protection came without a cost. In the Imperium, to be different was to court danger, and the line between miracle and heresy was thinner than a blade's edge. The boy grew used to the stares, to the way conversations shifted when he entered a room, to the way even adults lowered their eyes in his presence. He did not yet understand fear as they did. He only knew that he lived when others did not. Nights grew colder as the Manufactorum's heat cycles shifted with the seasons outside seasons the boy had never seen. Wrapped in thin rags, he would press himself against the bulkhead, listening to the deep groan of the structure as though it were a living creature breathing around him. Dreams came more often now, sharper, their edges cutting into his waking thoughts. In one, he walked a corridor that stretched into infinity, its walls covered in glyphs that burned his eyes. In another, he stood on a battlefield, though he had never seen one, and the ground was made of skulls that whispered his name in 1,000 tongues. Always, when he woke, the scar burned like fresh fire. His mother aged quickly, her strength leached by years of giving more than she had. She often returned from her shifts with blood on her hands, not her own, but from accidents she had tried to mend before the overseers noticed. The boy would sit silently beside her, watching the way her lips moved in prayer even when she was too tired to form the words aloud. He wanted to believe, as she did, that the Emperor watched them, that his gaze might one day lift them from this place, but the silence of his dreams mocked that hope. The light he saw there was not the Emperor's. It was colder, stranger, and it watched him with a patience that unsettled even his young heart. Still, life did not pause. The Manufactorum demanded, and they obeyed. Days bled into one another, marked only by the occasional scream of a crushed worker or the tolling of the shift gongs. Yet through it all, the boy grew. He was lean, wiry, his muscles shaped not by play but by labor. His scar had deepened with age, now a pale fissure that seemed carved into his very identity. He spoke little, but when he did, others listened. Not because of eloquence, but because of the strange weight his words carried, as though he were repeating something older than himself. One night, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, He heard a voice that was not his mother's, not a laborer's, not even the echo of overseers' sermons. It was a whisper, coiled and resonant, sliding into the marrow of his thoughts. It spoke no words he could understand, yet he felt its meaning, heavy and absolute. Survive. He woke with a start, his scar hot as if branded anew, and for the first time in his life, he knew fear that went beyond hunger or punishment. Fear of something vast, something that had noticed him. The boy grew, and with growth came awareness. He began to see what others refused to speak of, the quiet despair in every face, the hollow eyes that stared into nothing as hands worked without pause. The way prayers to the Emperor were whispered less out of faith than out of fear that silence itself might be heresy. His mother still prayed, still whispered fragments of hymns as though they were ropes keeping her from sinking. But he could tell the strength was leaving her. Her voice cracked more often, her breath rattled when she lay down, her body shrinking into a husk. He hated the manufactorum then, not with the loud fury of youth, but with a cold resentment that burrowed deep. Its walls pressed on him, its endless noise suffocated him. It was not only a prison, but a devourer of hope, a thing that ate years and left behind only ashes. Yet even as he loathed it, he knew he was bound to it. No one escaped. Those who tried were recycled into servitors, their flesh bound to machines until even their souls seemed gone. He sometimes imagined what that must be like, trapped forever in a body of steel, singing binary hymns into eternity. Sometimes he feared that fate was already written for him, but fate has strange ways of revealing itself. On the day the manufactorum burned, his life was torn from its path and thrust into another. It began as all disasters did, with silence. The great machines, normally deafening in their song, halted one by one, their pistons stalling, their gears grinding to unnatural stillness. The sudden absence of noise was unbearable, like a void pressing against the ears. Then came the alarms, shrieking through vox grills, their tones distorted and panicked. Workers froze, then scattered. Overseers bellowing orders drowned out by the rising roar of fire. Promethium had leaked into one of the lower forges, and the spark of a failing circuit turned it into an inferno. Flames surged through the corridors, devouring oxygen, devouring flesh. Smoke filled the manufactorum, acrid and choking, turning the lungs to stone. The boy clutched his mother's hand as they ran through the chaos, stumbling over bodies already consumed by heat. The scar on his brow seared as though mirroring the fire itself, every step driving the pain deeper into his skull. He could barely see, his vision blurred by tears and smoke. But something inside him pulled, guiding him through the madness, urging him toward paths that did not collapse, vents that still held breath. They reached a bulkhead door sealed against the fire. Dozens of laborers hammered at it with bleeding fists, their screams muffled by the blaze behind them. His mother fell to her knees, coughing blood, her strength finally broken. The boy pulled at her, begged her to rise, but her body sagged against the steel, her eyes glassy. In her final breath, she pressed her lips to his forehead, directly over the scar, whispering a prayer that was neither sanctioned him nor forbidden memory, but something in between. Then her hand slipped from his, and she was gone. The boy did not scream. He could not. The fire roared, the alarms wailed, but within him there was only silence. He pressed his palm against the bulkhead, and the scar on his brow burned like molten iron. He did not know what he did, only that he willed the door to open, willed with every fiber of his being, with grief, with rage, with a force that seemed to claw through him from beyond. The bulkhead shuddered. With a groan of tortured steel, the locks disengaged. The door yawned open, spilling terrified laborers into the smoke-free corridors beyond. None noticed the boy at first. They only fled. But a few, turning back, saw him standing before the open door, his face lit by the glow of flame, his scar shining like a brand. When the fire was finally subdued, the Manufactorum was a ruin of twisted metal and blackened corpses. Hundreds had died, their bodies carted away to furnaces that would reclaim their flesh for the Imperium. Yet amid the wreckage, a rumor began to spread with feverish urgency. A child had opened a sealed bulkhead, a child marked by scar and by survival. The story traveled faster than the flames had, whispered in fear and awe. Some called him blessed. Others muttered that the warp had touched him. Overseers filed reports to the Adeptus Mechanicus, their words cautious, their tones heavy with suspicion. The boy sat in the ashes, his mother gone, the Manufactorum scarred, and for the first time in his short life, he understood what it meant to be alone. The scar on his brow throbbed like a wound that would never heal. And though he did not know it, his path had already diverged from those around him. He was no longer just another child in the He was something else, something the Imperium would not ignore. The Schola Progenium was no sanctuary, but a crucible. Those who survived the Manufactoria, the trenches, or the void, and who were deemed useful, were sent here. Orphans of the Imperium's endless hunger, collected and reforged into tools for the Emperor's wars. The boy with the scar was taken in silence, escorted by robed clerics whose faces were hidden beneath cowls. They did not speak to him as they led him through the gates. They did not need to. The scholar spoke with walls of steel and banners of the Aquila stretched across every surface. Its twin-headed gaze, watching, commanding, demanding his first steps into its halls, were met with the sound of drilled chanting. Hundreds of voices rising as one, reciting catechisms of loyalty and obedience. The thunder of boots against stone echoed through vaulted corridors, each sound a reminder that individuality was already being hammered away. He was stripped of his rags, his hair shorn, his body scrubbed raw until the grime of the Manufactorum was gone. Yet the scar remained. No cleansing could erase it, no blade could sever it. The instructors noticed, of course. Their eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, but they said nothing. The Imperium had its ways of watching, its ways of waiting. Days blurred into one another. Dawn was heralded not by light but by the toll of bells, the voice of the Aquila demanding rise, kneel, pray. They prayed to the Emperor in every action. To eat was to pray. To march was to pray. To fire a lasgun was to pray. Failure was heresy, and heresy was death. The boy adapted swiftly, his body conditioned by years of hunger and toil, his mind sharpened by the need to survive. He learned to strip and reassemble a las rifle before he could properly write the Emperor's name on a date. He endured punishments without breaking, endured pain without cry. And still, the scar was there, silent, watching, a mark that made even the most seasoned drill abbots hesitate for a breath before striking him. Children in the scholar did not ask questions. To ask was dangerous, for it suggested doubt, and doubt was a seed of corruption. But the boy's silence was not born of obedience. It was born of calculation. He listened when others complained in whispers. He memorized the patterns of guards, the cadence of sermons, the rituals that defined every breath. knowledge was survival. And though the priests thundered about purity, about devotion, he began to wonder if devotion was merely another word for submission. There were others who noticed him. Not friends' friendship was discouraged. Bonds meant weakness, but observers. A girl with pale hair and eyes like shards of glass, who excelled at every recitation and who never faltered in her drills, watched him as if measuring his every move. A boy twice his size, brutal in sparring matches, seemed always to challenge him first, as though proving dominance over him would mean something greater. Rivalries and alliances grew in the cracks of the scholar's rigid discipline, and though he sought neither, both came to him unbidden. It was during the weekly sermon in the chapel of the Aquila that the scar became more than a curiosity. The chapel was vast, its walls lined with statues of saints whose faces were eroded into anonymity by centuries of incense smoke. The air was thick, choking, as hundreds of children knelt in unison, repeating prayers after the preacher. The boy's voice was steady, quiet, blending with the chorus. But as the preacher lifted the Aquila high, the scar burned. It seared as though lit from within, and the boy collapsed, his body racked with pain. Gasps rippled through the congregation, though quickly silenced by the bark of guards. He writhed upon the cold stone floor, his fingers clawing at his brow, his vision white with fire. When he woke, he was in the infirmary, his body trembling with exhaustion. No wounds marked him save the scar, which now seemed brighter, sharper, as though freshly cut. The medicae looked at him with expressions carefully schooled to neutrality, but their hands shook as they recorded their notes on data slates. Whispers reached him even here, that he had collapsed during the Aquila's blessing, that the emperor's gaze had struck him down, or perhaps raised him up. Rumor spread faster than the sermons could contain it. Some students began to avoid him, muttering prayers whenever he passed. Others followed at a distance, their eyes hungry, as though proximity to him might offer protection or damnation. The instructors said nothing, though their eyes lingered more now, their commands sharper, their punishments swifter. They demanded more of him: longer marches, harsher drills, endless hours of catechism. It was as if they sought to grind the scar away by force of labor. But it did not fade. It only grew brighter, not in light but in presence, until it seemed to the boy that the Aquila itself stared not from the banners but from his own flesh. At night, he dreamed again, no longer of corridors or skulls, but of wings spread wide, shadows stretching across a broken sky. He heard voices chanting, not hymns of the Emperor, but words in a tongue he did not know, each syllable a weight that pressed into his bones. He woke in silence, drenched in sweat, his scar hot to the touch. And always he felt it, the sense of being observed, of being measured, not by his instructors, not by the Aquila, but by something older, something that waited. Discipline was the marrow of the school. Every child was expected to bend beneath it, to be reshaped into a weapon honed for the Imperium's ceaseless wars. The boy with the scar endured it as he had endured the manufacturum, with silence that unsettled his instructors. Most children broke eventually, some into tears, others into rage, but he did neither. He obeyed where obedience was necessary, resisted where resistance went unnoticed, and always he observed. That watchfulness was his shield. He grew stronger under the endless drills. The hunger of his early life had stripped him lean, but here food was provided, not in abundance, but in regularity. His body hardened, his reflexes sharpened. He learned to strike with precision in the sparring rings, his movements less about brute strength than about timing, about reading the flaw in an opponent's stance. It was in these moments that he seemed most unnatural, for his scar often flared when danger loomed, and he moved as though guided by instinct sharper than training. Rivals who mocked him learned caution after bruises that should not have been possible from one so small dot, but in the scar, strength alone was not enough. Faith was demanded in equal measure. Catechisms were beaten into memory, the Emperor's glory recited until throats bled. The boy repeated the words, his voice steady, but inside he felt the hollowness of them. The Aquila's shadow loomed everywhere, its twin heads watching every movement, but he did not feel the warmth others claimed. He felt only the weight, as though those wings pressed down, smothering thought. The sermons spoke of light and salvation, but his dreams still whispered in voices older, voices that promised neither. It was during one such sermon that a test came. The drill abbot, a man whose augmetic eyes glowed red in the dim chapel, demanded that each child step forward and pledge aloud their loyalty to the throne. Most recited without hesitation, voices trembling with rehearsed devotion. When the boy's turn came, he stood silent. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. The scar burned again, fierce, blinding, and his throat locked as if seized by unseen fingers. The abbot's mechanical arm rose, ready to strike punishment. But then the boy's voice broke free, not in prayer but in a single word that echoed through the chapel. Here, the word rang like a knell. It was not the pledge demanded, yet its sound carried weight beyond its syllable. The abbot froze, his arm suspended. The congregation stirred, uncertain whether to fear or to bow. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only when the abbot lowered his hand and barked for the next child. But the damage had been done. Whispers grew louder after that day, whispers that the Emperor himself had spoken through him, or that something far darker had claimed his tongue. Punishments followed, harsher than before. He was lashed for hesitation, forced to march until his legs buckled, denied rest when others slept. Yet still he endured, still he rose, still the scar did not fade. His body bore fresh welts and bruises, but his gaze remained steady, his silence unbroken save for what necessity demanded. To the instructors, he was a puzzle. To the children, he was becoming a myth. One evening, during combat drills, the scar revealed itself again. The pale-haired girl, his constant observer, was his opponent. They circled in the sparring ring, practice blades in hand. She struck fast, sharp, her movements honed by ruthless precision. Yet each time her blade cut toward him, his scar flared, and his body moved before thought. He parried, dodged, struck back with a speed that left even the abbot watching in silence. When the bout ended, her blade knocked from her grip. She stared at him, not in anger, but in recognition, as though she had seen something she had been waiting for. She said nothing, only touched her chest where the Aquila badge was stitched, and gave a nod that was not of victory, but of acknowledgement. That night, his dreams deepened. No longer whispers, no longer only shadows. He saw the Aquila itself, its wings vast across the stars, but its twin heads were hollow, faceless, empty sockets staring. And behind it, in the void, another light flickered, not golden like the Astronomicon, not steady, but wild, searing, alive. He woke, gasping, his hands clawing at his scar, the word from before echoing in his skull. Here, the scholar continued its relentless rhythm. Bells, drills, sermons, lashes. Yet beneath it all, beneath the iron discipline and the Aquila's ever-watchful gaze, something was stirring. He felt it in the scar's heat, in the way others watched him, in the way even the priests faltered when their eyes met his. The Aquila weighed on them all, but upon him it pressed heavier, as though measuring whether he was burden or weapon. And though he did not yet understand, he knew his life was no longer his own. The seasons passed within the scholar's walls, though no sun or storm marked them. Only the toll of bells and the change in drills told the passage of time. The boy grew taller, his shoulders broadening, his muscles wiry with strength. But though his body became more soldier than child, his eyes retained that watchfulness, that silence which no drill abbot could beat away. He was not the strongest among them, nor the fastest, but he endured. And in the Imperium, endurance often mattered more than brilliance. Rumor had become his constant companion. The incident in the chapel was not forgotten. Some whispered that the Emperor had chosen him, others that demons clawed at his soul. Both beliefs carried danger, for either could draw the attention of those who wielded authority like a blade. And yet, the whispers spread, too slippery for the priests to silence. It was not uncommon to see children touch the Aquila over their hearts as he passed, not in devotion to the throne, but in fear of him. The scar upon his brow had ceased to be a wound. It was a symbol, and symbols in the Imperium were more dangerous than blades. He was tested constantly, though never openly. The overseers assigned him drills harsher than those given to others, sent him into sparring matches against opponents far larger, forced him into recitations after nights with no sleep. He endured, sometimes failing, sometimes bleeding, but never breaking. That refusal to shatter unnerved even the abbots, for they had seen countless children reduced to sobbing wrecks. This boy stood silent, scar burning faintly as if to remind them. He belonged to something they could not name. It was during a live-fire exercise that his fate shifted again. The recruits were marched to the firing range, each handed a lasgun heavy, awkward in small hands, but deadly nonetheless. The instructors barked orders, their augmetic voices rattling through the air, demanding precision and speed. The boy shouldered his weapon, his movements efficient, though he had handled it only a handful of times. He squeezed the trigger, and the recoil jolted through his bones, the smell of scorched air sharp in his nose. The target disintegrated beneath the beam, a neat hole burned through its center. The instructors gave no praise, but their eyes lingered too long. Then the alarm klaxons shrieked. The range doors burst open, and a servitor stumbled in, sparks trailing from torn cabling. It should not have been there. Malfunctioning servitors were removed before they could threaten the students. Yet this one, half blind and half mad, staggered into the recruits, its grafted weapon arms spasming with live fire. Children screamed, scattering loss beams, scorching the walls. The boy froze for a heartbeat, scar flaring with heat. He turned, raised his lasgun, and fired. The beam struck the servitor's head, dropping it instantly in a spray of sparks and smoke. Silence followed. The children stared, some in awe, some in horror. The instructors rushed forward, barking orders, herding the students back into formation. The incident would never be recorded as truth. It would vanish into the scholar's archives, buried under redacted ink. But those who had seen, those who had heard the sound of that single shot, began to whisper louder than before. The boy had not hesitated. He had not flinched. His scar had glowed faintly in the muzzle flash, as though guiding his hand. Punishment should have followed. Disobedience to wait for command, deviation from formation. independent action, these were all crimes in the rigid order of the school. But the instructors did not punish him. They looked upon him with something like fear, something like reverence, and they moved on. The message was clear. His path was no longer bound by the same rules as the others. That night, the pale-haired girl approached him. It was forbidden to speak outside sanctioned hours, but she came to him in the shadows of the dormitory, her voice a whisper beneath the snores of exhausted recruits. "You are marked," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. He said nothing, only met her eyes, and in that silence an understanding passed between them. She did not mean the scar alone. She meant the weight that pressed upon him, the weight that bent even the Aquila's shadow. She touched her chest, where the Aquila badge gleamed faintly, and whispered a prayer he could not hear before slipping back into her bunk. Sleep did not come easily. The scar burned again, his dreams writhing with visions. He saw the Aquila fracture, its wings tearing apart, one head devoured by shadow, the other burning with flame. He heard the sound of a voice, not the whisper of survival, not the chant of the priests, but a voice vast and sorrowful, speaking words he could almost understand. "You are here. You are seen." He woke with a cry lodged in his throat, sweat soaking his sheets, his heart pounding. The schola's bells tolled for morning, and the drills resumed as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The Aquila weighed upon him now, not as symbol alone, but as a burden that threatened to crush or transform him. And though he could not yet choose, he began to understand that his destiny was not to be just another soldier. He was something else, something the Imperium had not prepared for. The schola did not slow. Its walls did not bend to whispers. Its bells did not toll any softer for children burdened with fear. Life within it pressed forward, relentless, as though the machinery of the Imperium itself demanded it. Yet, for the boy with the scar, each day grew heavier, as though unseen eyes had fixed upon him and would not look away. He carried that weight into every drill, every spar, every prayer, and it marked him as surely as the scar on his brow. During combat simulations, the difference became undeniable. Recruits were thrust into mock war zones, crude recreations of trench networks and manufacturing ruins. Blanks roared, smoke choked their lungs, instructors barked orders to force them into panic. Most stumbled, breaking formation, shouting incoherently. The boy moved with precision, his motions fluid, his instincts unnervingly sharp. Where others tripped, he advanced. Where others hesitated, he acted. More than once, he saved fellow recruits from blunted blades or blank rounds, his scar flaring bright enough that some swore they saw it even through the smoke. These moments did not go unnoticed. The pale-haired girl shadowed him more closely now, though never in words her gaze was enough. The larger boy who once challenged him began to avoid him, muttering oaths beneath his breath whenever their paths crossed. And the instructors, their tone shifted, subtle but real. They no longer treated him as a child in training, but as something being measured, not just for obedience, not just for strength, but for potential. The chapel sermons grew more pointed. The preachers thundered about vigilance, about rooting out corruption that could grow even within the faithful. They spoke of false prophets, of signs and symbols that could mislead the righteous. Though they never named him, the boy knew their words were aimed like blades. Children glanced at him during those sermons, their lips tight, their eyes filled with unease. Faith was demanded, yet his presence made their faith tremble. He did not need to speak, his silence was its own sermon. It was after one such sermon that he found himself summoned. Two men in black, their robes marked with the sigils of the ecclesiarchy, led him through the labyrinthine corridors into a chamber he had never seen. It was small, circular, its walls lined with candles that dripped wax like blood. A single aquila hung above the doorway, its twin heads glaring down. The men asked him questions, not about drills or catechisms, but about his dreams. Did he hear voices? Did he see visions? Did his scar burn during prayer? His answers were few. He said he dreamed, yes, but so did others. He said nothing of the voices, nothing of the fire. Silence was survival. The men pressed, their tones sharpened, their questions laced with suspicion. Yet no truth escaped him. In the end, they dismissed him, but their eyes lingered, heavy with unease. He left the chamber with the knowledge that the scholar was no longer his only watcher. The ecclesiarchy had noticed, and once the ecclesiarchy noticed, the Inquisition could not be far behind. That night, his dreams shifted once more. He stood on a battlefield vast beyond comprehension, the sky fractured, the ground littered with bodies both human and alien. Above him, the Astronomicon burned, its golden light stretching across the void. But beside it, another light flared, wild, jagged, his scar seared as though molten iron were pressed to his flesh. He fell to his knees, his voice torn from him, a scream he could not hear over the thunder of unseen war. And then, silence. A silence so complete it felt like death. When he woke, he did not cry out. He sat in his bunk, his breath ragged, his hand pressed against his scar. Across the dormitory, the pale-haired girl watched him. In the dim glow of lumen strips, she raised her hand to her brow, mirroring his scar with her finger. Not mocking, not fearful, a gesture of recognition. He lowered his gaze, but the meaning lingered. She saw him. Perhaps more than anyone else, she saw him. The bells tolled again, and the scholar continued, unrelenting. Yet for the boy, the path was no longer hidden. The aquila loomed above him, but it was no longer merely the Imperium's symbol. It was a weight, pressing him toward a destiny he could neither refuse nor escape. He felt its gaze in every step, every breath, every flicker of his scar, and deep within, where dreams bled into waking, he knew the Imperium did not yet understand what he was. But soon it would. War awaited them all. That was the truth the scholar never hid, only sharpened with every drill, every sermon, every scar upon young flesh. The children raised within its walls were not being taught to live, but to die usefully. Some would march into the ranks of the Astra Militarum, las guns in hand, their lives spent in days, perhaps hours. Others, rarer, would ascend to the stormtrooper cadres, trained for strikes where ordinary soldiers were ground to dust. Fewer still would find themselves in the retinues of the Inquisition, to serve or to be consumed. The boy with the scar knew this, though it was never spoken aloud. He felt it in the way every corridor smelled of oil and incense, in the way every meal ended with the same catechism, "The Emperor protects." But protection was not what awaited them. The Emperor demanded, the Emperor devoured, and so, each day, he trained, body and mind shaped for survival in a galaxy that despised weakness. By adolescence, he had become a presence among the recruits, not a leader by appointment, for the scholar allowed no such roles, but by the strange gravity that seemed to draw others into his orbit. He spoke little, but when he did, the others listened. His scar etched deeper into his flesh with every year, glimmered faintly beneath lumen strips, and the whispers it inspired had not faded. Some still believed him marked by the Emperor, others whispered of darker forces. Yet whether in reverence or in fear, the children began to follow his example. When he stood firm in punishment, they endured longer. When he held his silence under questioning, they learned caution. He was not alone, yet he was set apart, bound to a fate they did not share. The instructors noticed. Their drills grew harsher, their punishments crueler. Yet even their cruelty became fuel. The boy endured lash and hunger, exhaustion and pain, and rose each time, his scar a pale flame on his brow. His silence unsettled them, for obedience was expected to be loud-shouted prayers, recited litanies, broken voices pledging loyalty. His obedience was quiet, and that quiet carried power. They could not name it, but they felt it, as though something vast watched through his eyes. It was during a survival exercise that his difference became undeniable. The recruits were herded into the wastes beyond the Schola's walls, a dead expanse of ash dunes and rusting ruins. The task was simple: survive 3 days with nothing but what they carried. Many faltered quickly, some starved, others grew delirious from thirst. A few disappeared into the wastes, never to return. The boy pressed forward, silent, focused. He scavenged what others overlooked, wrung moisture from rusted pipes, found shelter in ruins where shadows fell just right. Others began to trail after him, at first by chance, then by intention. The pale-haired girl among them, her eyes sharp and unyielding, seemed to understand his path better than he did. On the second night, the sky above the wastes burned with unnatural light. Warp storms flared in the upper atmosphere, their colors searing, wrong, streaking the heavens with veins of emerald and violet. The recruits cowered, muttering prayers, some weeping openly. The boy stood, his scar blazing hot, his eyes fixed on the shifting heavens. He felt something watching him from beyond, vast and cold, its gaze piercing through the storm. It whispered, not in words, but in weight, pressing upon his chest until his breath grew ragged. And yet, he did not fall. He stared back, unblinking, until the light faded and the sky grew dark once more. By the third day, when the bells of the Schola summoned them back, fewer than half the recruits returned. Many were carried on stretchers, broken and half-dead. The boy walked under his own power, his scar raw and throbbing, his clothes torn, his body marked by exhaustion. Yet his eyes were steady, and behind him trailed those who had chosen to follow his path. The instructors did not praise him. They never praised. But their silence was louder than any words. Reports were written, notes filed, and somewhere beyond the Schola's walls, his name, or perhaps only his scar, passed into records far more dangerous than he knew. That night, as the survivors lay in their bunks, broken and hollow, the boy dreamed again. This time he saw himself upon a battlefield not of ash but of stars. Armies clashed beneath Himestra, Militarum, Space Marines. Alien hordes he could not name. Above them all loomed a light, golden and eternal, the Astronomican's beacon. But from his scar, another light poured forth, wild and searing, splitting the sky. The armies faltered, turning toward him, not in worship, not in fear, but in recognition. He woke with a scream caught in his throat, his scar blazing as though aflame. The scholar bells tolled again, dragging him back into drills and catechisms. But something had shifted. The machinery of survival was not merely grinding him into another soldier. It was shaping him into something else, something the Imperium could neither predict nor control. And though he could not name it, though he feared it as much as he yearned for it, he knew the truth. Survival was no longer enough. Destiny waited. The scholar hardened them further with every passing year. Each lesson stripped away weakness and forged obedience. Yet for the boy with the scar, the forging only revealed something deeper. He learned tactics from data slates filled with campaigns long forgotten, their words etched in the blood of soldiers who had died nameless. He learned discipline in the sparring rings where mistakes meant bone-deep bruises, where mercy was never granted. He learned loyalty in the chapel, where silence was demanded as the priests thundered of the Emperorâ. Is he eternal? But beneath all of it, beneath the rote memorization and endless drills, he felt the scar burning like an ember that refused to cool, as if every lesson was being measured against something older, something unseen. The children grew into adolescence, and with age came fractures. Some embraced the scholar's demands with fervor, their eyes hollow with devotion. Others broke under the strain, their bodies or minds cast aside as failures, reclaimed into servitors, or vanished into silence. The boy endured. Not without struggle, not without wounds, but with a persistence that unsettled even his peers. He did not break, and that refusal became a mirror. Others began to measure themselves against him, not through rivalry but through the strange magnetism that drew them closer. He had no desire to lead, yet he found himself at the center of groups, recruits watching his silence as if it carried weight beyond words. The pale-haired girl was always there. She challenged him in sparring, followed him in drills, watched him with the same quiet intensity she had shown since their first clash. Once, during a night march across the wastes, when the cold cut into their bones and the weaker children stumbled, she came to his side. "They look to you," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. He said nothing, only adjusted his pace to steady those falling behind. Her gaze lingered a moment longer, then she fell into step beside him. Words were unnecessary. Recognition was enough. The instructors pressed harder. They saw the way others looked to him, the way his scar seemed to glimmer in firelight or smoke, and they grew wary. Orders came harsher, punishments swifter, as though breaking him would prove the scholar's supremacy. They starved him longer, lashed him harder, forced him into drills that lasted until his muscles trembled with exhaustion. Yet he endured. The lash left scars upon his back, but they healed faster than they should have. Hunger hollowed his cheeks, but he walked still. Each time they sought to crush him, he rose again, and with each rise, the whispers among his peers grew louder. It was in the winter of that worlder. Winter marked not by snow, but by a cold that turned the metal walls brittle, that the scholars staged a war game meant to cull the weak. The recruits were divided into squads, sent into the ruins of an old manufactorum, its corridors choked with ash and shadows. Their task was simple: retrieve a data slit guarded by servitor soldiers, return it without loss. The boy was assigned a squad of those the instructors deemed weakest, a punishment disguised as chance. He accepted without word. The ruins were a labyrinth of rust and silence. Servitors stalked the halls, their weapons spitting blank rounds that stung like fire. Recruits fell quickly, crying out as they were marked dead by instructors watching from hidden vantage points. The boy moved ahead, silent, his scar hot against his skin. He led his squad through paths others ignored, sensing danger before it came, moving as though guided by something beyond instinct. Twice, he pulled recruits from fire before it reached them. Once, He forced them into cover a heartbeat before a servitor's weapon swept the corridor. When they reached the data slate chamber, only half of them remained. The servitor guardians stood motionless, eyes glowing, weapons ready. The boy did not hesitate. He advanced, drawing their fire, his scar blazing as though answering the threat. Blanks seared his flesh, but he moved through the pain, striking down one servitor with a scavenged blade, disabling another with a Loz beam aimed true. His squad surged after him, emboldened, cutting down the rest. The data slate was theirs, and for the first time, the instructors recorded something unusual. A squad led by the weakest had returned victorious. Their casualties fewer than most. Punishment should have followed again. He had taken command when none was granted, but instead, silence. Reports filed, notes added, no lash, no sermon. The scholar's machinery had no category for what he had done, and somewhere beyond, in offices he would never see, decisions began to shift. His scar was no longer only a mark. It was a record. That night, he dreamed not of corridors or battlefields, but of the throne. He saw the golden throne itself, vast and terrible, its cables writhing like veins across terror's heart. Upon it sat a figure too bright to look upon, its face a ruin of light and shadow. The boy felt its gaze pierce through him, not in blessing, not in curse, but in recognition. His scar flared like fire, and he woke screaming into the silence of the dormitory, his fellow recruits staring in terror and awe. The bells tolled. The drills resumed, and the machinery of survival ground on. But the boy knew now, more than ever, that he was not simply surviving. He was being shaped. Whether into weapon or warning, he could not yet say. The months that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of drills, prayers, and punishments, yet beneath the surface something had shifted. The boy's presence in the scholar was no longer just tolerated, it was studied. The instructors watched him with the cold precision of men cataloguing an anomaly, noting how others gravitated to him, how his scar seemed to shine brightest at moments of trial. They did not speak of it aloud, but their unease seeped into every command. He was not being trained in the same way as the others. He was being tested. The recruits noticed it too. Some clung to him as though he were a talisman, following his lead during drills, echoing his silence during sermons. Others grew resentful, whispering that he thought himself chosen, that his scar was nothing but a freak's mark. These rivalries broke into violence more than once, sanctioned in the sparring pits where blood was spilled on stone floors that had tasted it for centuries. He fought them all, not with cruelty, not with hesitation, but with a grim efficiency that left no doubt. He won not because he sought victory, but because his scar seemed to pulse at each strike, guiding his hand before the blow landed. One night, when the dormitory lay in silence, the pale-haired girl approached him again. She did not speak at first, only sat across from him, her eyes catching the lumen glow like chips of frozen glass. Finally, she asked, "Does it hurt?" Her gaze flicked to his scar. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. She did not ask again. Instead, she whispered a line of litany, one he had heard 1,000 times in sermons, through pain. "The Emperor tests us," but her voice carried no conviction, only curiosity, as though she doubted the truth of her own words. She left him then, but he carried her question into his dreams. The dreams were growing stronger. They no longer came as shadows and whispers, but as visions painted in unbearable clarity. He saw worlds burning, the sky torn by warships, the ground drowned in blood. He saw faces unknown, yet familiar turned toward him, their mouths moving in prayers or curses he could not hear. And always, above it all, he saw the Astronomicon burning in gold, its light steady, eternal. Yet beside it, like a wound in the void, another light flared wild, jagged, defiant. His scar seared when that light appeared, and he would wake gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, his pulse hammering. The instructors did not know of his dreams, though perhaps they suspected. What they did know was the effect he had on the others. During a grueling, forced march through frozen wastes, when recruits collapsed into the snow, he carried two on his shoulders until his knees buckled. Others, seeing him endure, pushed themselves beyond their breaking points. It was not loyalty they felt for him, but something older, something closer to recognition. He had become the measure of survival, the unspoken proof that they, too, might endure. The scholar's machinery was meant to forge loyalty to the throne, but here something different was being forged. This did not escape notice. One evening he was summoned again, not to the ecclesiarchy's priests, but to a man in plain robes, his face obscured by shadow. The man's voice was calm, too calm, as he asked questions that were not part of any catechism. "When you dream, do you see light?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "When you fight, do you hear voices?" Again, he denied it. The man studied him in silence, his eyes dark pools in the half-light, before dismissing him with a nod. Yet, as the boy turned to leave, the man spoke once more. "Survival is never accident. Remember that." The words clung to him. He did not know if they were threat or warning, blessing or curse. He carried them into the following days, and when he next entered the sparring ring, he found the phrase repeating in his mind. "Survival is never accident." The words burned as hot as his scar. It was during a later exercise, a mock ambush staged in the ruins beyond the scholar, that his destiny pressed against him again. Recruits stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, lasguns firing blanks, servitors shrieking vox litany as they struck. Chaos reigned, as it always did in such drills. Yet he moved as though the smoke parted for him, as though the noise did not touch him. He found his squad pinned beneath fire, panic threatening to shatter their formation. He did not command them, not with words, but by stepping forward into the hail of shots, his scar blazing like a wound of fire. They followed, emboldened by his presence, and together they turned the drill from slaughter into victory. The instructors recorded the outcome, their faces pale in the glow of their data slates. The children whispered louder than before, and the boy sat in silence that night, his scar still hot, his dreams waiting like jaws in the dark. The scholar's halls were designed to strip away identity, yet for the boy with the scar, the opposite was happening. He had become something the system could not fully contain. Every lesson, every punishment, every trial was meant to crush individuality into the uniformity of service. But instead, it only drew out the singularity of his existence. He was not rising above the others because he sought to. He was rising because the weight of survival demanded it, and because his scar burned like a beacon no one could ignore. The instructors, bound by duty and fear, recorded every anomaly. The ecclesiarchy whispered behind closed doors. The other children, those who feared him, those who followed him, carried his legend in secret tongues. Yet still the drills continued. Still the bells tolled. Still the sermons thundered. The machinery of survival ground on, its gears consuming flesh and faith alike. It was during the scholar's final culling, a trial designed to decide who among them would be molded into soldiers and who would be discarded. That the boy's path diverged completely. The recruits were armed and sent into the wastes once more, this time against a foe not simulated but real. Raiders, human scavengers twisted by desperation, had encroached upon the scholar's territory. To the ecclesiarchy, this was providence. To the instructors, it was an opportunity. To the children, it was terror. For the first time, their training would be tested not against servitors or blanks, but against flesh that fought to live. The ambush came swift and brutal. The wastes erupted with gunfire and smoke, screams echoing across the ash. Recruits scattered, their lasguns spitting fire as they fumbled for discipline. Many fell within the first minutes, their bodies crumpling into the dust, their names destined to vanish in forgotten reports. The boy moved through it all with a clarity that felt not his own. His scar seared as though aflame, and every step seemed guided by a force that lifted him above fear. He pulled others into cover, shouted commands that cut through chaos, and each time he raised his weapon, it struck true. The pale-haired girl was there, always near, her blade flashing in the gloom, her eyes never leaving him. Together they cut through the raiders, their movements like a rhythm older than their training. Where he faltered, she struck. Where she fell back, he advanced. Around them, recruits who might have broken found strength, holding lines, returning fire, surviving when survival should have been impossible. By the battle's end, the ground was littered with bodies, both raider and child. The scholars' overseers declared it victory, though the cost was staggering. Half the recruits lay dead or dying. Yet among the survivors, none spoke of the ecclesiarchy's sermons or the emperor's will. They spoke of the boy with the scar. They spoke of how he had led, not with orders, but with presence, how his scar had burned in the smoke, a pale light that drew them forward when despair threatened to break them. The instructors said nothing. Their silence was heavier than any sermon. The ecclesiarchy did not call him again, though he felt their gaze more keenly than ever. And in the deep hours of night, when exhaustion finally pressed his eyes closed, his dreams came with violence. He stood again on battlefields of stars, the Astronomicon burning gold above him. But this time, the wild light beside it grew stronger, brighter, until it rivaled the Emperor's beacon. His scar split open in the dream, pouring fire, and he awoke to find his brow wet with blood, the mark searing brighter than it had since the Manufacturum fire. The scholar carried on as though nothing had changed. Bells, drills, sermons, but everything had changed. The boy was no longer just surviving. He was becoming, and though he could not name what he was becoming, he felt the truth in his bones. The Imperium would not ignore him much longer. Its machinery of survival was forging him into something it could not predict, something it might not even be able to control. The boy had grown into a young man by the time the scholar's gates opened for him, not with triumph, but with inevitability. The machinery of survival had ground him down and sharpened him in equal measure, and now it released him into a galaxy that cared little for the fate of any single soldier. He marched out, not alone, but among a cohort of others, all clad in grey fatigues, all stamped with the seal of the Aquila. Yet still, he carried what none of the others did, a scar that glowed faintly beneath the cold light of dawn, a scar that whispered of something more. He was consigned to the Astra Militarum, like so many who had survived the scholar's crucible. There, he became another number in a regiment forged for war. He learned the chants of unity, drilled until his muscles remembered what his mind knew. Longer questioned, slept in barracks that smelled of oil sweat, and fear. But even among thousands, he was never only one. The same gravity that had pulled others toward him in the Schola followed him here. Men and women, hardened by hunger and scarred by training, found themselves drawn to his silence, steadied by the way he moved through chaos without falter. They whispered of his scar, some in reverence, some in dread. In the trenches, superstition spread faster than infection, and soon his name was carried by lips that had never spoken to him. The first war was against the orcs. They came in a tide of green flesh and rusted metal, roaring across the wastes of a frontier world whose name was forgotten even as the battle began. The boy crouched in the trenches, lasgun clutched tight, the air thick with the stink of mud and promethium. Artillery thundered overhead, shaking the ground, filling his ears with the deafening rhythm of death. Around him, men muttered prayers, their voices trembling. He said nothing. His scar throbbed, not with fear, but with an intensity that made his vision sharpen, his muscles tighten. When the orcs came, bellowing war cries that split the sky, he rose to meet them. The battle was slaughter. The Astra Militarum fired volley after volley, their lasguns cutting through the tide. But still the orcs came, their crude weapons biting, their laughter louder than the screams of the dying. The boy fought as he had trained, precise, unrelenting, yet more than training guided him. His scar burned with each strike, his hands moved before his mind commanded, and where others fell in panic, he stood firm. He cut down orcs with lasfire that found their eyes, their throats, their hearts. He dragged comrades from the mud, shielded them with his body, struck with a ferocity that defied the hopelessness of the charge. When the battle ended, the trenches were filled with corpses, human and orc alike. The air stank of blood and burnt flesh. The survivors sat in silence, their eyes hollow. Yet whispers rose again, spreading through the regiment. They spoke of the scarred soldier who had stood when others broke, who had fired as though guided by fate itself, who had seemed untouchable in the storm. Some called him blessed, others feared he was cursed, but no one denied what they had seen. The Commissars noticed too. They said nothing, but their gaze lingered on him longer than most. Reports were filed, marked with sigils he could not read, passed up chains of command that stretched higher than he could imagine. His scar, once dismissed as an accident of birth, was now a point of record, and in the endless bureaucracy of the Imperium, records had a way of becoming destiny. That night, he sat in the trench, the battlefield still echoing in his ears. He closed his eyes, and the dreams came again. Not of corridors, not of the Schola, but of stars. He saw the Astronomicon burning, steady and golden, its light stretching across the void. But beside it, his scar blazed, wild and uncontrolled, a light that did not guide but challenged. He saw fleets halt in their course, soldiers turn their eyes to the heavens, faith shaken by the twin lights, and in the silence between heartbeats, he felt it again, the sense of being seen, not by the Emperor, not by the Imperium, but by something vast, something old, something waiting. When he woke, his scar still glowed faintly, a warmth pulsing beneath his skin. The men beside him whispered and crossed themselves, muttering litanies as they edged away. But others, braver or more desperate, edged closer, as though seeking protection. He said nothing, only cleaned his lasgun and prepared for the next battle. Yet he knew the truth that none of them could see. His life was no longer only survival. It was becoming a story whispered across trenches, a symbol that could not be silenced. And in the Imperium, symbols were dangerous. War did not relent. The Imperium was a tide of unending conflict, and the boy with the scar was swept from one battlefield to the next, his life consumed by the march of orders and the roar of weapons. He fought on Hive-world streets where every lumen flicker hid an enemy sniper. He fought in jungles where the air itself was poison and the trees whispered with alien tongues. He fought in void ships, boarding actions where blood and fire floated weightless in the cold abyss. Always he endured, always he survived, and always his scar burned. The whispers grew louder. Among the Astra Militarum, superstition carried more weight than rations, and soon the scar was no longer simply a mark but an omen. Soldiers who marched beside him returned alive more often than not. Squads shattered in chaos, yet those who followed his lead seemed to find their way through. Carmises, sharp-eyed and ruthless, noticed this pattern. Though they spoke only in clipped tones, their reports sealed with inquisitorial sigils. The boy did not seek the whispers, did not crave the reverence or fear, but he could not escape it. His scar shone in the smoke of battle, and men swore it was the Emperor's light, guiding them where faith faltered. Others muttered of witchcraft, of a curse that would bring ruin. It was on a desert world, under a sky scarred by warp storms, that the whispers threatened to become something more. The regiment was ordered to hold a line against raiders whose allegiance was uncertain, some said traitors. Others claimed they were merely desperate outcasts. The truth did not matter. The order was clear: hold until relieved, or die where you stood. The battle raged for days, the air filled with the endless stench of promethium, the sand stained black with blood. The boy fought at the center, his scar blazing so fiercely that even through helmets, soldiers swore they saw its glow. On the third night, when the enemy's charge broke like a wave upon their trenches, something happened that none could later explain. The boy rose above the parapet, lasgun clutched tight, his voice carrying across the din. He did not shout orders. He did not cry prayers. He spoke a single word, low yet thunderous, the same word he had once spoken in the scholar's chapel, here. The battlefield stilled, as though the word itself bent the air. Soldiers felt their fear fall away. The enemy faltered, their charge breaking against the sudden, inexplicable surge of defiance. And when the fighting resumed, the line held. Though by all accounts it should have shattered, whispers became proclamations after that. Men called him a saint, a living icon of the Emperor's will. Others recoiled, convinced he was a psyker, a danger that should be purged before his presence drew demons. Carmises watched with eyes like knives, torn between the weapon he might become and the threat he represented. The boy himself said nothing. He cleaned his weapon, buried the dead, and endured the weight of stares that pressed upon him harder than any lash. But deep inside, he felt the truth. He had spoken not as the Emperor's vessel, but as his own. The scar burned not with the Astronomican's steady gold, but with the wild light of something that defied the Imperium's order. At night his dreams came again, more vivid than ever. He saw the golden throne, its cables writhing like veins, its occupant shrouded in light so fierce it blinded. He saw the Astronomican blazing across the stars, its beacon steady. And then he saw his own scar shining beside it, a second flame that split the heavens. Armies turned their gaze upward, faith shaken, voices raised in awe and fear. And above it all, he heard whispers, no longer indecipherable, but clear, resonant, terrible. You are not chosen. You are not cursed. You are witness. He woke trembling, his scar still warm, his breath ragged. Around him, soldiers watched with eyes wide, some making the sign of the Aquila, others shifting away as if from a fire too near. He knew then what the dreams meant, though he dared not speak it aloud. He was not the Emperor reborn, not a saint to be venerated, nor a witch to be purged. He was something else, a scar carved into the Imperium itself. A reminder that survival could shape destiny in ways no sermon could control. The battles continued. The whispers spread. And the boy with the scar, now a man hardened by war, felt the gaze of the Imperium pressing down upon him. He had become more than soldier, more than survivor. He had become symbol. And in the grim darkness of the far future, symbols could ignite empires, burn them to ash. The war did not end. It never did. Victory in the Imperium was not triumph, but reprieve, a pause before the next slaughter. And so the scarred soldier was carried onward. From one battlefield to another, the whispers of his presence preceding him like a litany both sacred and dangerous. His name was not recorded in the administratum's ledgers. Only the mark upon his brow travelled in hushed stories across regiments. To some, he was the scarred saint. To others, the cursed survivor. Yet whichever name they used, the weight was the same. He was no longer only himself. He was becoming myth, the Inquisition noticed. They always noticed. It began with shadows at the edge of the camp, figures in black robes whose insignia shifted in the light. Questions were asked of his commanders, their answers filed into reports that vanished into higher archives. Once, as he cleaned his lasgun by the dim glow of a lumen, he felt eyes upon him and turned to see a robed figure watching from the trench's edge. The man said nothing, only touched the Aquila over his chest before fading back into the darkness. It was a gesture that carried no reassurance, only the promise that judgment would come. Yet still, the soldier endured. On another world, he fought against the Necrons, whose soulless ranks marched with mechanical precision, their Gauss weapons stripping flesh from bone in green fire. The trenches collapsed, the ground split open, and men screamed as they were unmade. In the chaos, the scarred soldier stood unbroken, his scar burning so fiercely that comrades swore they saw its light cut through the shadow of the Xenos. He dragged the wounded from collapsing bunkers, fired until his lasgun overheated, and when his squad was cornered, he led them through a path that should not have existed. A path later found sealed by unyielding stone. None could explain it, but all remembered when the battle ended, with the Imperium claiming victory at the cost of tens of thousands. Whispers spread again, sharper now. Some said the Emperor had shielded them through his vessel. Others whispered of sorcery, of warp-born miracles that defied comprehension. The commissars executed a dozen men for such talk, but execution could not silence rumor. Rumor had already become story, and story was harder to kill than flesh. The scarred soldier began to feel the weight more keenly. It was not only the stares of comrades or the suspicion of commissars, but something greater, an oppressive sense of eyes upon him, stretching across the stars. At night, his dreams were no longer visions of war alone. He saw terror itself, the cradle of the Imperium, its golden spires rising above oceans of humanity. He saw the Astronomicon burning across the void, its light steady. But beside it, he saw his scar reflected in the stars, a mark not on his flesh, but upon the galaxy itself. And in the silence of that dream, he heard again the voice that had haunted him since childhood: survive. He woke drenched in sweat, his scar hot as a brand, the word echoing in his bones. Survival had brought him here, had carried him through Manufactoria, through the Schola, through war after war. But now survival felt like something more, something heavier. Perhaps he was meant not only to endure, but to remind the Imperium of endurance itself. Perhaps he was meant to stand a scar, proof of wounds that never healed. A question carved into the galaxy's flesh. His comrades began to look to him not only for survival, but for meaning. In the trenches, in the void ships, in the ruins of hive cities, men asked him silently, "Why do we fight? Why do we live?" He never gave answer, for he had none. Yet in his silence, they found strength, mistaking his wordlessness for certainty. His scar spoke louder than his tongue ever could, and still the Imperium watched. He felt its gaze in the way reports were filed, in the way strangers in robes whispered his name in camps, in the way commissars hesitated to strike him even when discipline demanded it. He was no longer only a soldier. He was a question. And in a galaxy built upon answers carved in faith and fire, a question could be the most dangerous thing of all. The scar had followed him from cradle to Manufactorum, from Schola to trench, and now it burned across the stars themselves. What once was a wound had become symbol, and what once was symbol now threatened to become prophecy. The Imperium thrived on prophecy when it served its purpose and killed it when it did not. He stood balanced between the two, alive only because his survival was too useful to ignore and too dangerous to destroy. It was on the world of Desolatia that the whispers reached their height. The campaign there was endless attrition, the planet a graveyard of collapsed hives and poisoned skies. For months, his regiment held a line against an enemy that shifted like shadows. Cultists whose voices rose in hymns not to the Emperor, but to powers unspoken. The scarred soldier fought as he always had, unyielding, precise, enduring. Yet even in victory, there was no triumph, only the piling of corpses, human and heretic alike. One night, during a lull in the fighting, he found himself summoned to a command tent lit by lumen lamps that flickered as though nervous. Commissars stood there, priests too, their faces tight with unease. At the center of the table lay a data slate, glowing with records that bore his name. They spoke to him of whispers spreading too far, of soldiers calling him saint, of enemies fearing him as witch. They demanded to know what he was. He gave no answer. He stood silent, his scarf faintly glowing beneath the lamps. Silence, as it always had, was his shield. They did not execute him. They did not exile him. Instead, they sent him back into the lines, as though the battlefield itself might answer what no priest or commissar could. And there, in the chaos of Desolatia's final siege, his scar burned brighter than ever before. The enemy surged in tides of faithless zeal, the ground shuddering beneath their chants. The Astra Militarum wavered, their lines buckling. Then he rose, his voice carrying once more across the din, the word as old as his childhood, as sharp as his survival. Here, the sound cut through fire and smoke, through prayers and curses. The line steadied. Soldiers who should have fled instead advanced. The enemy faltered, their hymns drowned beneath a roar not of faith, not of doctrine, but of defiance. In that moment, it did not matter if he was saint or psyker, chosen or cursed. He was Scar, standing against the stars, a wound that refused to close, a presence that refused to be erased. When Desolatia burned, when its hives fell silent and its skies turned black, the scarred soldier survived. He stood among the ruins, his scar throbbing like a heartbeat against the void. Rumors spread farther than before, carried not only by soldiers, but by refugees, by priests, by the fearful and the reverent alike. Some swore he was the Emperor's sign, a reminder that humanity could endure even the darkest trials. Others claimed he was an abomination, a wound that would one day fester into ruin. He said nothing. He had no words for what he was. He only knew that the Imperium itself now whispered his existence. And in a galaxy where whispers could topple worlds, silence had become the loudest voice of all. Above him, the Astronomicon burned steady, the golden light of the Emperor's eternal throne. But beside it, in his dreams and perhaps in truth, another light flickered wild, unbound, scarred into the heavens, and he understood at last that he was neither salvation nor damnation. He was reminder, he was witness, he was scar, and in the grim darkness of the far future, even a scar could change the course of eternity.